Most of us think the first time Jonah was in trouble was that massive storm, but it actually started much earlier than that. The real first sign was an open boat, a paid fare, and a clean exit that looked like a total win. It felt like help, it looked timely, and it probably even felt like God's favor was on him. But here's the thing, that easy way out was the very thing carrying him away from the heart of God. That hits home pretty fast because so many believers pray for a big purpose, but then we pull back the second that purpose starts messing with the comfortable life we've built. We ask God for a calling, then we start to panic when that calling gets expensive or demands too much. You have to ask yourself if that open door in front of you is actually a confirmation from heaven. What if it's just an escape route with really good timing? Jonah wasn't actually scared of hard work, but he was terrified of what his obedience would eventually undo in his life. Maslow actually gave this specific fear a name called the Jonah Complex, which is basically the fear of your own highest possibility. Scripture goes even deeper than that because sometimes our real idol isn't pleasure or money, but it's a life we can still keep under our own control. When you put Jonah next to Jesus, you feel the difference immediately because one man flees the Father's will while the other says he has come specifically to do it. The first chapter of Jonah doesn't actually start with a giant fish, but it starts with a direct word from God. God tells Jonah to go to Nineveh, and Jonah immediately decides to head the exact opposite way. This matters because the center of this whole story isn't about the spectacle of a whale, but it's about the resistance in the human heart. Nineveh was tied to the Assyrian Empire, and people feared the Assyrians for some very good and very dark reasons. This wasn't just a tough ministry assignment or a case of the nerves for Jonah. The prophet Nahum later called Nineveh the bloody city. And when you look at archaeology, you can see exactly why he said that. Assyrian war carvings show intentional terror-like beheadings and impalements because they turned cruelty into a form of public art. God was sending Jonah toward a brutal enemy people, the kind of people a faithful Israelite would much rather see judged than forgiven. His refusal carries a massive amount of moral and national weight because he isn't just avoiding a dangerous place, he's actively resisting the scandal of God's mercy. Then the geography of the story really sharpens the whole point for us. Jonah goes down to Joppa, which was a real port on the Mediterranean coast, and from there he books a ticket to a place called Tarshish. That wasn't just some random stop on a map. Tarshish likely pointed toward the far west, near modern-day Spain, which was over 2,500 miles away from the furthest place possible from his calling. Jonah doesn't just drift away by accident, but he plans the escape. He pays the money and he boards the ship. This gives us the first big payoff of the story. The enemy will often help you with transportation when you are trying to run away from God. Rebellion rarely looks wild or crazy at the start, but instead it looks funded, available, and weirdly easy to pull off. I want you to pause for a second and ask yourself if there's an open boat in your life right now. Is there an easy exit from a hard act of obedience that you know you need to do? If that lands for you, go ahead and type evaluating in the comments below. You have to watch the movement in this chapter because everything keeps going down. He goes down to the city of Joppa, then he goes down into the ship, and later on, he even goes down into a deep sleep. When believers run from God, they'll always start to descend. Picture the lower part of the ship where it's dark, damp, and the wood is creaking while the salt hangs in the air. It's a place where a man can curl up and go totally numb while his life slides out of place. Sin doesn't usually feel like it's falling off a cliff at first, but it feels like walking down a long staircase. This is where the theology gets painfully direct for all of us. Jonah is not only fleeing a specific task, but he's trying to flee the very presence of the Lord. It's not that God can actually be escaped. And Jonah even admits that God made the sea and the dry land. But disobedience is always relational before it's behavioral. A believer doesn't just break a religious rule, but he resists the rule of a living person. He pulls away from the heart of God because the call of God is carrying him somewhere he does not love or want. Now, I want you to set that right beside the life of Christ. Jonah goes west to get away from the call, but Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem to fulfill it. Jonah runs away from his enemies, but Jesus walks directly towards sinners and gives his entire life for them. The shadow of Jonah starts making the true servant shine so much brighter, and that changes how you read this whole chapter. Jonah isn't just a simple lesson in failure, but is a dark backdrop that makes the obedience of Christ look even more stunning. One of the hardest truths in this entire story is that the first sign you are out of God's will might not be pain. It might actually be how easy that boat was for you to find. There was an open ship. He had enough money to pay the fare and enough numbness to fall fast asleep. Disobedience can feel very smooth for a while and can even feel peaceful in a strange way. That numbness is where the story starts sounding very current because Jonah isn't just hiding in a boat. He is using motion, distance, and sleep to avoid what obedience would force him to face. That reaches us very fast because people still do this today. It is not always in obvious ways. Think about this for a second. Abraham Maslow once talked about something called the Jonah Complex, and it's basically the fear of your own greatness. It isn't just that you are scared to fail, but you are actually terrified of what happens if you succeed. You worry about the weight of it, the people watching you, and that one big yes that changes the entire shape of your life. For those of us following Jesus, this goes way deeper than just psychologically because it hits our worship right where it hurts. You see, a calling from God never lets you stay in the driver's seat of your own life, and it demands that you surrender your plans and stop trying to rule yourself. Most of us ask God for direction, but the moment that direction starts messing with our comfort, we suddenly need more time or more clarity. Let's be real. Sometimes that isn't actually discernment at all, but just plain old delay with some Bible verses slapped on top of it. You can see this playing out in real life every single day. Is that job application you never actually hit send on because getting it would change your whole weekly routine? Or that ministry idea you keep polishing but never actually start? Is that hard conversation you avoid by calling it bad timing? Or the gift you keep burying under the guise of being humble or modest? We close the tab when conviction gets too loud and choose the safe job or the safe church role because those are the versions of obedience that let us stay in control. Then there's the cleaner version of running away. Maybe a man feels a nudge for years to build something for the kingdom, but right when that call gets too loud to ignore, a better job title opens up with more money. Everyone around him calls it favor, and on paper, it looks like a responsible move. But deep down, he knows exactly what happened. He didn't fail by being reckless. He escaped by being sensible. And this kind of thing happens in church spaces way more than we like to admit. A study from Life Way back in 2025 found that 37% of pastors who left ministry said a change in calling was the main reason. And by 2026, about 24% of senior pastors in the US said that seriously thought about quitting in the last year. Sometimes a new direction is a real thing from God, but other times it's just exhaustion or fear dressed up in spiritual language. Or think about a woman who has real strength and clarity, but she's terrified of being seen, so she hides behind the idea of modesty. She calls it a quiet season or hiddenness, which sounds really humble until you ask the hard question. Is she actually bowing before God, or is she just protecting herself from what obedience might expose? That's the sharp edge of this whole thing because some people call it peace when it's really just permission to stay exactly the same. They say they don't feel led when the truth is they're just scared of the consequences. and they call it waiting, even though the only thing growing is their list of excuses. Staying small like that comes with a massive cost. Your prayer life starts feeling mechanical, and your joy just dries up until you are left holding onto the image of obedience while losing the actual life of it. After a while, the safest version of your life becomes a cage with Bible words written on the walls. But when you put that next to Jesus, the whole illusion falls apart, because Christ never used humility as an excuse to avoid doing what God said. He showed humility by obeying, which means the opposite of pride isn't shrinking back. It's simply telling God yes. Jonah's big problem wasn't just that he was weak, but that he had a major conflict with the kind of God he was supposed to serve. He didn't want a God whose mercy reached people he didn't like. And we still struggle with that today. We want the calling, but we don't want the undoing that comes with it. We want to be used by God, but we don't want Him to rearrange our lives. When that fear turns into a cage, God doesn't always leave the door locked from the inside. And sometimes He shakes our whole world until the things we're hiding in start falling apart. This is where the story gets a little embarrassing for the prophet, because men who don't even know the Lord are about to act with more heart than the man of God Himself. God has an answer for Jonah's flight, and He decides to answer it with the word. The Bible says the Lord hurled a great wind onto the sea. And that specific word really matters here. God didn't just allow a storm to happen in this story. He actually sent it. The wind, the waves, the cargo, and even the dice the sailors threw were all moving under His command. Jonah could pay for a boat ticket, but he couldn't buy a world where God just steps aside and lets him do His own thing. Now, look at how everything flips. The sailors are doing exactly what you'd expect people to do when they're trying to stay alive. They are crying out, they are working hard, they are tossing cargo overboard while asking tough questions. Meanwhile, Jonah is the prophet of God and is doing absolutely nothing. He withdraws, he goes quiet, and he actually goes to sleep. That image should really bother us, because it proves you can know the truth about God and still be completely useless to the people around you if your heart is resisting Him. Eventually, the captain goes downstairs and finds him, and you can really feel the shame in this moment. A pagan sailor has to wake up the man of God and tell him to pray. Not to lead a meeting or preach a sermon, but just to pray. The prophet, who should have been the most awake to what heaven was doing, had to be shaken awake by someone who wasn't even part of the covenant. Think about the sting of that for 1 second. Being caught in a spiritual nap by the very people you were supposed to be helping. It hits hard because the world often sees our spiritual sleep way before we do. And sometimes the wake-up call we need comes from the people we assume were beneath us. This still happens today in much smoother ways. A person leaves a difficult situation because a clean new opportunity opens up with better pay and an easier transition, and everyone calls it an open door. It's only much later that they realize that easy boat was actually carrying them away from the hard work God wanted to do in their soul. Once they told the Lord, and the finger points to Jonah, and the truth finally comes out into the light, they ask him who he is and where he's from. And Jonah tells them he's a Hebrew who fears the Lord, and the God of heaven who made the sea and the land. The confession is technically right, but that's exactly why it hurts so much. He's claiming God made the sea, while he's actively trying to hide from Him on that very sea. His mouth is saying the right religious words, but his life is denying them in front of everyone. Let's be honest, we do this too. We talk about the sovereign God, but then we live like obedience is only for the parts of life that doesn't cost us much. This is the point where the storm gets personal. It isn't just happening around Jonah anymore. It's actually revealing who Jonah is. The sea becomes the place where his hidden resistance gets dragged out into the daylight. And that teaches us a tough lesson. When God confronts us, it isn't always a sign of rejection. Sometimes it's actually His covenant love refusing to let one of his children vanished into a smaller, shriveled up life. And here is a quick midpoint check for us. The storm isn't just there to stop Jonah's feet. It's there to expose the fear that's driving him. God isn't just messing up his travel plans. He's tearing open the version of Jonah that would rather stay small than obey. This gives you a simple way to audit the open doors in your life. Just ask yourself if this path makes it easier to obey or easier to avoid. Does it make you deeper in truth and sacrifice, or does it mostly just protect your comfort and your image? When you pray, are you actually looking for light, or are you just asking God to bless the exit strategy you already picked out? Now, not every hard time is a Jonah storm, because the Bible doesn't say all suffering means the same thing. But some storms are what you might call a severe mercy. God isn't being petty when he ruins the setup that was killing your obedience. He's actually being incredibly faithful to you. If you put Jonah next to Jesus again, the contrast gets even wider. Jonah sleeps while everyone else is in danger because his rebellion is what brought the danger in the first place. Jesus also slept on a storm, during a storm. But when he woke up, he rebuked the wind and the waves. One man slept because he was withdrawing from God, while the other slept because he had total rest and trust in his Father. One man had to be exposed, while the other revealed himself as the Lord of the deep. The strangest part of this whole story is that the storm isn't even the biggest mercy. The biggest mercy is that God still wanted Jonah, even after Jonah said no. That should be a huge encouragement to anyone listening who knows what it's like to resist, to delay, or to try to bargain with God. When your comfort stops working and the life you built starts to crack, it might be more than just a disruption. It might be the mercy of God refusing to leave you in the small life you chose for yourself. Jonah isn't the only person in the Bible who tried to back away when God started talking. I think it's important to remember because feeling reluctant isn't actually that strange. But here's the thing we have to consider. What if Moses had just stayed there at the burning bush and never left? What if Jeremiah decided that being young was his entire identity and just stopped there? What if Gideon stayed in hiding forever? Or if Peter went back to his fishing boats and never let Jesus fix his heart? If those men hadn't moved, whole chapters of history would look completely different than they do today. Think about Moses for a second, because he had a list of excuses ready at that bush. He asked who he was to do such a thing. He worried people wouldn't listen, and he even complained that he wasn't a good speaker. He basically begged God to send anyone else, and his resistance came from a deep feeling that he just wasn't enough. God didn't try to flatter him or tell him he was great, but instead he answered with his presence by promising to be right there with him. Jeremiah sounds a little different, but the struggle is basically the same. He told God he was only a youth, naming the very thing he thought disqualified him from the job. God didn't wait for Jeremiah to feel like an adult or feel ready for the task, but he answered by telling the story of how he chose him before he was even born. He was known and appointed before he ever took a breath, which shows us that God's timing doesn't depend on our confidence. Then you have Gideon, who was literally hiding in a wine press when an angel showed up and called him a mighty warrior. That probably sounded like a joke to him because he didn't feel mighty at all. But God wasn't talking to the man who was paralyzed by fear. He was speaking to the man that obedience was about to uncover, seeing the potential that Gideon couldn't see in himself yet. Peter carries this same pattern into the New Testament, but his story has a much sharper wound. He was the guy who talked big and then completely fell apart when the pressure was on. Even though he promised to be loyal, he denied Jesus and collapsed right when it mattered most. Yet the risen Christ still came back to restore him and tell him to feed his sheep. His failure didn't erase the calling on his life, but it definitely humbled the man. This matters a lot because a lot of us aren't really asking if you are called, but we are asking if you can still be used after the delays and the mistakes. Peter is the answer to that question because your worst moment doesn't get the final word when Jesus is the one doing the restoring. I want to know which of these guys sounds most like you right now. So tell me in the comments if you are a Moses, a Jeremiah, a Gideon, or a Peter. Look through the replies while you are at it, because you might find someone else fighting the same no that you are, and your honesty could be exactly what they need to hear. When you put all four of these men beside Jonah, you really start to see the difference in their hearts. Moses feared he wasn't enough. Jeremiah feared he was too young. Gideon feared he was too weak. And Peter had to taste the bitterness of failure. Jonah was different because he feared what obedience would do to his comfort and his own personal terms. But every single one of them had to face the same reality of God's claim on their lives. All of these stories point us directly toward Jesus. Moses needed help and Jeremiah needed strength, while Gideon looked for signs and Peter desperately needed to be restored. Jesus is the only true sent one, who never took a single step back from what the Father wanted him to do. That's why your calling doesn't actually rest on how ready you feel, but it rests on being connected to the Son who obeyed perfectly. Because of him, God's answer to our fear is still the same promise that he is with us. The moment the sailors finally throw Jonah into the sea, the water goes quiet instantly. That sudden calm is a huge sign that the storm was never just random weather, but it was actually about Jonah the whole time. It's a shocking scene because the sailors are moving toward the fear of the Lord at the exact same time the prophet is sinking under the waves. This reversal happens throughout the book to wound our religious pride and show us that God works in ways we don't expect. It's only after all that chaos that a fish finally shows up. It doesn't appear at the start of the story, but it comes in late, as if the story was holding it back on purpose. The Hebrew text calls it a great fish rather than a whale. But the biology isn't the point here. The point is that God didn't let Jonah finish his collapse. And the fish was there because God chose to show mercy in a way Jonah never would have picked for himself. Most people look at the fish as a punishment, but the story is actually doing something much deeper than that. Yes, Jonah is being stopped and hemmed in, but is also being kept alive. If God had left him alone, he would have just sunk to the bottom in his rebellion. So God prepares a place that was dark and tight, but still managed to save him. That's a hard truth for us to accept because we want mercy to feel like a hug. But sometimes mercy looks like shutting every single exit. This hits home in real life because the deep place is usually where our fake sense of control finally dies. We tend to talk to God in a very casual way as long as we think we can manage the outcomes and keep our comfort intact. But when those terms break and we run out of options, our prayer life changes and becomes honest and plain. Many of us don't even start to speak the truth to God until we have absolutely no way left to keep ourselves afloat. You can see this happen all the time. Imagine a man who spent years running away from the one thing God pressing on his heart. He stayed busy and kept his life looking respectable, telling himself the timing wasn't just right yet. Then one day, the whole arrangement fell apart when his career stalled and his relationship started to thin out. Suddenly, he's alone, with no noise left and no new boat to buy. Just the long ache of hearing the voice he tried to drown out. In that total collapse, he finally prayed without editing himself or using religious language. And it was probably just a simple cry for help. The crisis didn't create his calling, but it cornered him until he couldn't lie about it anymore. That is why we should see the fish as a form of mercy rather than just force. God is willing to build a prison if that's what it takes to show his love to a stubborn heart. He will take away your room to run if your freedom has turned into nothing but rebellion. That sounds harsh because it is severe, but it's still mercy because the goal isn't to destroy you, but to bring you to a place of surrender. Once again, this whole story opens up and points us toward Christ. Jonah's 3 days in the deep are a sign, but the contrast between him and Jesus is just as important as the pattern. Jonah was saved from death after fighting against God's will, but Jesus entered into death by obeying the Father's will perfectly. Jonah ran away from a mission to his enemies, while Jesus came specifically to save his enemies. Jonah was carried by a mercy he didn't even want, but Jesus became the very foundation of mercy for people who didn't want him at all. The deep place in this story isn't the gospel itself, but it's a pointer toward the one who would go even lower and do it willingly. This is where the running finally starts to break down. It doesn't happen when your excuses sound weak, but it happens when your comfort loses the power to protect you from God. In that dark place, obedience starts out small and it usually feels very costly. It might be a simple prayer, a confession, or a hidden yes to God. But before we make this story sound too neat and tidy, you have to see what happens next. Jonah is about to get the kind of results every preacher dreams of, and yet it still won't fix the mess inside of him. It turns out you can succeed in your assignment and still be completely out of touch with God's heart. Jonah finally makes it to Nineveh, and he walks right into the heart of the city to deliver the warning God gave him. What happens next is something nobody could have seen coming because the entire city actually listens. People start believing the message, they humble themselves, and even the king gets on board with the change. If you just look at the surface, this is the exact ending every preacher dreams about. Heck, I dream about it. The mission is a total success. The word hits home, and the city turns around. But the story doesn't stop there because God isn't just looking for results. He is after the heart of the person doing the work too. When you get to Jonah chapter 4, the curtain pulls back to show us why he really ran away in the first place. He didn't run because he was scared of the people, but he ran because he knew God was gracious, merciful, and slow to get angry. His biggest problem wasn't fear or failure, but he actually didn't want mercy to win in that city. That should really make us stop and think for a second. It's possible for a person to obey on the outside while still staying completely opposed to God's heart on the inside. You can finish the job and still resent what God is doing through your hard work. Think about it. You can preach the truth, serve every week, and build something great while still carrying a private grudge against grace. This hits close to home because so many of us want a calling, but we only want it if it comes with a version of God we like best. We want a purpose in life, but not if that purpose ends up blessing the wrong people. We want to make an impact, but only if we get the credit and admiration that goes with it. Jonah is a warning to us because he proves that man can be useful to the kingdom and still be miserable. Here is the bottom line of the whole situation. Jonah got the revival in the city, but he kept resentment in his heart. That is what success looks like when you don't have surrender. If you put Jonah next to Jesus one last time, you see the sharpest contrast in the whole Bible. Jonah announces judgment and gets angry when mercy follows. But Jesus takes the judgment on himself so that mercy can flow to everyone. Jonah sits outside the city walls, burning with anger over God's grace, while Jesus weeps over the city and gives his life for the very people who rejected him. One man can stand how generous God is, but the other is the generosity of God in the flesh. This exposes a lie we tell ourselves today that sounds spiritual even when it's not. We often call our comfort wisdom or maturity or balance, but when comfort is the thing you protect most, it starts acting like holiness while it quietly kills your courage. That is how someone stays looking polished in public while feeling completely hollow in private. It is totally possible to be used by God where people can see you while you are still pushing back against Him in the secret places of your life. So what does real inner change actually look like? It isn't just about having better behavior or a longer ministry resume to show off. It gives you a heart that finally agrees with God and a soul that can actually be happy when mercy reaches people you wouldn't have picked. That is the one thing Jonah missed out on. The barrier isn't always a lack of talent or opportunity, but sometimes the barrier is just being attached to a small life that feels easy to control. Jonah's story leaves us with a tough question. Do you want God's job for you, or do you actually want God's heart? Maybe your Tarshish isn't some big act of rebellion. It might just be a life of delay and ease that you've arranged to stay comfortable and manageable. I want you to name one area where God has already been clear with you, and then take one real step toward it this week. It might be a confession you've been avoiding, a hard phone call you might need to make, or just a simple act of service. Pray a plain prayer and ask God to break that false sense of peace so that obedience becomes sweeter to you than staying in control. God isn't chasing you down just to punish you, but it's actually after you because your Nineveh needs the person you become when you finally say yes. You weren't created to hide away in the bottom of the ship because you were made to walk right beside God every single day. If a storm has found you lately, don't look at it like the end of your story, since it might actually be the very beginning of your real purpose. Hit subscribe if you want more Bible stories that really hit home like this one did today. Then go ahead and comment with just one word, Tarshish or Nineveh, so I know where you are. If obedience feels way too expensive right now, you should watch the miracle that ends your debt, the widow's oil multiplied by Elisha. Because your next big breakthrough usually starts when you trust God with whatever you have left. That video is somewhere on the screen now.